Ron Miller's education and background is in geology and environmental consulting, but since moving from Vermont to Georgia in 2006, he is focused on instructing and consulting rope rescue and access. He is a director of the Cave Cliff Technical Unit of the Chattanooga-Hamilton County Rescue Service and a former chair of the Southeastern Cave Conservancy. Ron has participated in 29 expeditions in Lechuguilla Cave since 1990. With that, Ron, I'll let you go ahead and take the reins.
All right, so this afternoon, I'm going to talk a little bit about the discovery and exploration of the Coral Sea. As Beth talked about earlier this afternoon, Lech expedition does not start when you get on rope at the entrance pit. It actually starts with planning, in many cases, a year or more in advance. Back in 2004, as it became clear that Learn was winding down, Kathy Bohr, Art Fortini, and I decided to spend some time at the park offices researching a proposal to do a private expedition into Lechuguilla. It occurred to us that maybe the Far East branch might be a good place to go because it was an area that seemed to have less interest. It seems to intimidate a lot of cavers. The West and Southwest seem to be a lot more popular and probably a lot more competition. So even though we hadn't really done much work in the Far East, we decided that that's what we would be focusing on. So not only did we look at all sorts of notes, we looked at lead lists and compared those lead lists to the Compass database to see what had been actually surveyed. So we didn't make the mistake that we often make of going to these awesome leads only to discover blue survey flagging heading off into what we thought was an awesome lead. As it happens, Peter Bostad was also on the 2004 expedition that we had stayed afterwards to do some research on. And he also was meandering at the park for a few days after the expedition. So I took the opportunity to interrogate Peter and ask him if he had any good ideas on where we might find potential going passage in the Far East branch. And he very quickly shared that he thought an area that he had discovered with Ann and Donald Davis back in 1990 had some potential. He told me about an area on the edge of the outback that had some lakes, Halloween Lake and Flake Lake, and some calcite speleothems and flowstone, and to his knowledge had never been revisited. So I thought that was pretty intriguing, and we included that in our proposal. Now, y'all have seen images like this quite a bit today. This is a profile view of the cave looking slightly to the northwest. The multicolored aspect of it is that it's colored by date. The newer surveys in the Far East are kind of in green. And then zooming in on that Far East branch, this is what the Far East looked like in profile back in 2004. And as John introduced this morning, one of the areas in the upper Far East near camp, the Boundary Waters and the Las Pecos River, are known for their extensive water and calcite speleothems. In very much contrast, the outback area down in the lower section of the cave is pretty dry and featureless. As shown on this map here from Pat Cambyses, you can see in the upper section, Las Pecos River, which is the water source for Grand Guadalupe Junction Camp, has quite a few pools there, also wet dreams and boundary waters. Pools are pretty much everywhere. Here you see Peter looking at one of the pools in boundary waters. Here's the water source at the Las Pecos River for Grand Guadalupe Junction Camp. In very much contrast to that, the outback in the lower section of the cave is pretty dry, featureless. It's bedrock, breakdown. Everything's covered with silt that's been dissolved out of the silt matrix breccia. There are extensive pancakes, three-dimensional mazes, but hardly any water and hardly any decoration. So we put together a proposal at the end of 2004 for a private expedition to explore the lead that Peter had given to us, as well as numerous other tasks over the course of a week-long expedition. In 2005, Steve Maynard and I led an expedition to what turned out to be the Coral Sea. We spent 16 days exploring in the Coral Sea area. We mapped a little under 3,000 feet in what became known as the Coral Sea. What you see here is passage that Peter actually had discovered back in 1990. It's the first of many clothes changing areas. Here we only have to change our shoes because you're just walking up a flowstone slope. This is looking up that flowstone slope. And at the very top of that slope is a formation that Peter had discovered back in 1990, known as the Purple People Eater. That formation doesn't actually exist in black space. Behind it is an alcove. And looking at the same formation from a different angle, you can see a nice flat area. Well, that flat area is a perfect place for a foothold to climb up to into that alcove. But early on, we developed a rule, and that was, if it's in the coffee table book, it's not a foothold. So even though it made it somewhat more awkward, we have had a pretty unblemished record, I think, of never stepping on this formation. At the top of this area in the alcove was an unpromising alcove. The first sign of something might be to it is this tiny little calcite lined rim in the floor of the passage that was blowing some air. A person that was on lead tape that day was newcomer Gary Dunkley, otherwise known as Dunk, on his first and what turned out to be only expedition into Lech. And Dunk is a proponent, as are many of us, that a passage doesn't end until you look at the end and the floors, walls, and ceiling have ended. And in the back of that alcove, he saw a narrow fissure that was lined with aragonite and calcite crust, pretty tight, but it was blowing air. And he wormed and struggled and thrashed his way up into that fissure. About 8 feet up into it, he found a horizontal lead continuing the fissure that turned into what ended up being the Coral Sea. As I followed him up into that fissure, I noticed red staining on the pure white calcite crust and aragonite, realizing that he had donated some blood to the cave in service of the effort. So that became known as Blood Fissure, which is the discovery entrance to Coral Sea. On the far side, we discovered a small room. We named it the Popcorn Room for lots of coralloids and cave popcorn and crinkle blisters. And that was pretty much the end of the first day. We was spent surveying that small room. The next day, Kathy Borer and Rich Sundquist and others surveyed through a pancake passage into a little drop off, and looking down on that drop off, they saw these corroded aragonite bushes with popcorn terminations that they thought resembled dancing bears. So that became known as the Hall of the Dancing Bears. Here's the bears with scale. They're pretty small. They're micro bears. Here's a shot looking at one of the aragonite bushes in Hall of the Dancing Bears. Jed Mosenfelder is sporting aqua socks. We hadn't gotten to a full closed transition, but as Art talked about earlier today, the Coral Sea, like the areas that he was talking about, is a land of many awkward closed changing transitions. There were several leads out of the Hall of Dancing Bears. Later in the expedition, I did one climbing lead that led up and to another pit, which we ended up naming the Milky Way pit after a streak of white flowstone running down the middle of it. As John mentioned this morning, this is the first discovery in the lower outback of running water running off the soda straw termination of this stalactite. The bottom of Milky Way pit were some nice pearls, but no air and no going leads. So that was pretty much it for the 2005 expedition in that direction. This is a close-up of a section of the map that Aria Mildice is drafting. This just shows the results of the first expedition. You can see in the bottom, the purple people eater leading to Blood Fissure, and then leading to this pancake area here that popped out into the Hall of the Dancing Bears. Hall of the Dancing Bears is about 150 feet long, 100 feet wide, and about 80 feet tall. The climbing lead ended up heading up over to here to Milky Way pit, and that was pretty much the end of exploration in 2005. In 2006, Rich Sundquist and I led an expedition that focused on the Coral Sea. We spent 12 team days in the Coral Sea and generated a little under 3,000 feet of passage. Later in that year, John Lyles also led an expedition that spent one day and generated about 360 feet of passage. The photo in this shot is a lead that wasn't even noticed on the first day of sketching. But on the second day, Rich noticed this lead. I know there's no scale in this, but there's about to be. He sent his wife, Midori Sundquist, up into that lead, and she popped out the other side into about an 8 by 15 foot room, changed clothes because there was a flowstone lead, crawling lead on the other side. And that led to an area that we called Independence Hall. Independence Hall is so named because it was discovered on the 4th of July in 2006. It's about 80 feet long, 30 feet wide, and about 25 feet high. And as you can see, it has a lot of water. The lake in Independence Hall was named Lake Aloha. So we spent several days sketching in Independence Hall. We had several high leads out of the area that led to other lakes, but all those leads ended. Nevertheless, there's some very nice coralloids in the cave in Independence Hall. The team found a bypass around the edge of Lake Aloha through some boneyard passage that led to another similarly sized room that we called the New Guinea room, about 60 feet long, 30 feet wide, and about 35 feet tall. The New Guinea room was characterized, as you can see here, by purple and brown and red and yellow and white grapes. Here's a map that Aria is working on. The brown area that's pretty much just an outline at this point represents the area that we surveyed in 2006. In 2007, Rich and I led another expedition. We spent even more time in the Coral Sea this time, 15 team days, and we got over 4,100 feet of surveyed passage. We took another stab at the Milky Way pit. This is Kathy descending. There was a lead partway down the pit that required kind of swinging into. That lead led to a series of fissure passages that in turn led to another large room that we named the Wasp's Nest after the Rillencairn that covered bedrock boulders throughout the room, and in many cases was covered by calcite that we thought resembled the inside of a wasp's nest, hence the name. Another room that was found at the same time beyond the wasp's nest was a room that we called the Anglican basement, which is kind of a continuation of the same room. It's similar sized, 170 feet long, 30 feet wide, and about 25 feet high. Coming out of the wasp's nest, there's a lot of flowstone, and on the left, you see a flowstone slope that represented a climbing lead. Art Fortini and I climbed this later the same year. It turned out to be a 3-pitch climb that we ended up naming the Sestrugi climb after this flowstone pattern that we found in a section between two of the pitches that I thought resembled the wind-carved snow that's called Sestrugi. Here's the same shot essentially with scale. This is me looking up to the 3rd pitch of the Sestrugi climb. And this is Steve Maynard climbing up that, ascending the rope up that 3rd pitch. As you can see, the walls and floors are just covered with all sorts of calcite speleothems, which continued at the top. You have extensive draperies, lots of multicolored flowstone, aragonite bushes, tray and aragonite bushes, more pools, and going passage. We didn't explore too much farther this year. However, at that point, we knew that we were pretty close to getting underneath boundary waters in the Los Pecos River. So we pushed every climbing lead that we could possibly find. Unfortunately, every one of them ended in a flowstone choke. One of the reasons that we were pushing so hard was at this point, it was about 3.5 to 4 hours from camp via this route. And if we could somehow manage to break through up into the upper level, that 3.5 hour trip would turn into about a 15-minute trip. Here's Art climbing yet another one of these flowstone climbs. In 2008, John Lyles did an expedition that spent a team day there, just under 400 feet of passage. They found an area they named the Rectory off the Anglican basement, nice aragonite bush. Later that same year, Kathy and I led an expedition that spent 10 team days in the Coral Sea. We netted about 1,800 feet of passage. One of the things that we noticed, particularly in 2008 and later, was a lot of microbial activity. This is some flagging tape that is moldy, that's actually in the entrance area to Coral Sea in the Flake Lake area. It's been known for a long time. Moldy flagging is really not seen all that much in anywhere else but the Coral Sea area and right near it. This really caught our attention. This was a note that we had placed below the top pitch of the Sestrugi climb. A year later, the microbes had consumed about 1/3 of the paper. In 2009 and 2010, John Lyles did a couple more expeditions. It spent a day each in the Coral Sea, netting about 1,000 feet. In 2011, Rich took the reins for a year, and we spent about 17 days in Coral Sea, getting a little over 750 feet of passage. We continued climbing leads. Again, nothing has gone, as James and Derek have alluded to. Most climbing leads in Lech and many other caves don't go. As people have talked about extensively today, the Coral Sea was the first place in Lech that snottites have been found. This was the first snottite that was discovered in 2011. There's a close-up of that same snottite. We'll be talking a little bit more about that in a few minutes. In 2012, John and Rich did another expedition to the Far East. They spent one team day in the Coral Sea, netting 279 feet of passage. This slide represents the highlights of Coral Sea and Far East exploration in 2013 to 2015. As you can see, there's not a lot because no permits were approved for these 3 years for a couple of reasons. One, the Park Cave Resource Office was suffering some pretty extensive staff attrition. Management was not replacing staff, and they had very limited ability to approve expeditions. The second reason was that the Far East suffered in terms of priority because we didn't have any active cartographers that were producing maps for the park, and getting maps done is a big priority for the park. In 2016, a cave specialist was hired, Rod Horrocks, and he approved several expeditions. We did one in November 2016, led by John and Rich. We spent 2 team days in the Coral Sea, got about 460 feet of passage. One of the nice things about the team in 2016 was we had 2 awesome German cave photographers, Ingo Dorsten and Rainer Straub, who helped photo document some of the pretty neat features of Coral Sea. This is another shot of Independence Hall, and you can see Lake Aloha very nicely in this shot. This is some of the coralloids in Independence Hall. More purple coralloids and ex-aragonite bushes and draperies in Independence Hall. So Coral Sea has a couple of meanings. What people often think about are the coralloids that are throughout the area. Actually, our original intent in naming the Coral Sea was as a comparison to the outback. The outback in Australia is a dry, featureless desert like the outback in Lechuguilla Cave. To the northeast of Australia, in Earth's geography, is an area called the Coral Sea. So that was our original intent, but as you can see from these shots, there's extensive coralloids in the Coral Sea, and so that is a fitting name as well. These popcorns are corroded. Some popcorns are elongated with little popcorn growing on the ends of the popcorn. Others have little aragonite bushes growing on them. Some of them have more extensive aragonite growing off the terminations of the popcorn. I promised a couple more shots and a video of the snottites. We found 3 more snottites in 2016. This is a shot of one of those. Here's a scale. Here's another one. Reiner magically caught a droplet in midair with this. And here's that promised video. It's a for real snotite. I can tell you for sure that even though the chemistry of these has not been evaluated, they are not dripping sulfuric acid. They are coming off of calcite speleothems, and they're dripping onto calcite flowstone floors. If this were sulfuric acid, it would be eroding hole or dissolving holes into the floor, which is not happening. And in 2018, we did the most recent expedition. We spent 4 team days. As you can see, we're getting to a point of diminishing returns in the Coral Sea. We're down to 361 feet despite spending 4 team days. We spent a lot of time doing climbing leads as well as pushing leads that just did not go. And you end up spending a lot of time documenting the lead area for a very short shot. More evidence of microbial activity.
Sorry, 5 minutes.
Thank you. Another microbially consumed note. This one warned cavers who might think of ascending this 8mm rope out of the Hall of the Dancing Bears up to the MODA survey, that we had no rope pads on that rope and they should climb gently. as you can see, the microbes decided they didn't really want that message to be transmitted. One small discovery in 2018 was an area called the Wine Country. This is a shot of Aria mildice's legs as she popped up through a tiny hole that I couldn't fit up through, but she and Heather Levy surveyed this area. So where do things stand at this point? Our current statistics, we've surveyed a little under 2.9 miles of included survey in the Coral Sea. That represents about 10% of the known passage in the Far East. The Far East is about 27 miles of passage. I didn't mention this during the talk, but we've made 4 connections to the outback. I believe all of those were in known holes. One of those leads was actually surveyed, was generated as a lead the same year that we discovered the Coral Sea. It ended up being a shortcut to the wasp nest 2 years later. We have spent 60 team days exploring Coral Sea. It might seem like a lot for under 3 miles of passage, but I can tell you that we have worked hard. The 2 things that contribute to that are a lot of climbs, which don't generate a lot of footage unless they go, and a lot of clothes changes in awkward places. 40 people have surveyed in Coral Sea to date, and I estimate based on volunteer hours on trip reports that we have contributed over 3,000 volunteer hours in documenting this part of Lechuguilla Cave. Aria is doing awesome work on drafting up the map for this section of cave, and she's gotten the first 2 expeditions almost complete. As I promised, here is what we have produced in the Coral Sea relative to what was known in 2004. Coral Sea area is in green. You can see this kind of right rising line here. That represents the Sastrugi climb that led to an upper level and a series of climbs. And we're within about 40 feet of Los Pecos River and the Boundary Waters areas. This is a list of all 40 people that I'm aware of that have surveyed in the Coral Sea and the years that they surveyed. I would like to thank all of the photographers that contributed to this show. And in particular, I'd like to acknowledge the support of the staff at the Cave Resource Office and Peter Bosted, without whom this area might never have been discovered. Aria Mildice is our cartographer. Also, all of the expedition leaders have put in all the planning to make these expeditions happen, 12 expeditions to date, and of course, those survey teams. And that's what I have. Thank you.